Hey, in this video we're going to talk about making a competitive offer and what's involved in negotiating an offer if you're a first-time home buyer or you're not a first-time home buyer. So let's get into it. What we're going to cover in the video is, contingencies that come up, different points of negotiation between the seller and the buyer, what you need to do as a buyer to make your offer stand out amongst other offers, and so you can get the home of your dreams. So, the first thing that a seller wants to look for is, they call it the best and fairest offer. Highest and best is often the term they use, meaning they want to consider, first obvious point is price. What's the price point? And in that respect, I'll say, well, what's the highest offer in terms of price, but best also in the other underlying terms of the offer, highest and best offer. And so what are some of the other terms of an offer separate from the price? That's the obvious thing. Well, other terms would be things like contingencies, such as, many sellers talk about they want to sell their home as is. So, if you're going to come back and say you want all these repairs done after an inspection, that may not be suitable to certain sellers. They might want to still sell their house as is. That's an example of other terms, that the seller would consider these are the best terms for me. So we're going to go over some other of those points in this video. So the first thing, like as I mentioned, was highest and best. What's the highest and best? And also the idea is, best and final. So that's another term that you're going to hear about offers. Is this the highest and best offer? And is it the best and final offer? Meaning, when you make an offer on a home, don't hold anything back. Imagine this is your one and only chance to put in an offer. So in other words, it's your final offer. So in other words, don't go in thinking, well, the house, they want 400, so maybe we'll offer 395 and see what they say. And then, we'll hold back another 5 or 10 for later, if we can negotiate. You don't want to do that. You actually, if you have the full amount, 400, or if it's a competitive market where there's other multiple offers and someone's actually offered, say the house is 400 and someone's offered 405, maybe you have 410 or 407, and that's, you're thinking, well, that's my final offer. Well, put your final offer in on the very first time. Don't wait for a second time, because you probably won't get a second chance. So that's what is meant by the idea of highest and best offer. So put your best foot forward, put your highest price that you can afford in the very first offer. That's the very first thing to consider. And then with that in mind, there's another thing that will look good to a seller, and that's called an escalation clause. And what's an escalation clause? Well, an escalation clause is where you as the buyer, let's go back to the example of, let's say that the house is listed for 400,000, and let's say you actually have 410 available that you can put down, but you just want to offer 400, and what you can do with an escalation clause, it basically says, we're going to offer 400,000, but we are willing to escalate the amount we're going to offer on the house $1,000, for example, over the highest offer. So let's say someone else offers 405,000. That means your escalation clause would raise your offer to the 405,000 plus the additional 1,000, so 406,000. So that's what an escalation clause does, but then you usually have a contingency where you say, we're willing to pay whatever it is, 500 or let's say $1,000 above the highest offer, contingent upon proof of the highest offer. So in other words, let's say the seller does have an offer of $405,000, and then they show you proof that they do in fact have that offer, then your offer escalates to $406,000. And you could even do it then in the escalation clause, you would say usually up to an amount which you're willing to go, because if you don't, that means it's just open-ended. So an example of the escalation clause would be something like you had 410 that you're willing to offer. You offer 400,000, and you say we're willing to escalate your offer to $1,000 above your highest offer up to a maximum of $410,000. So that's something that could also make your offer more attractive to the seller. But people don't do that all the time, and it's not always done, but it's just something to consider if you are in a competitive market and you know there's multiple offers on the home. You can put an escalation clause in there. So that's a second point of consideration. The next thing, that's important to the seller is the earnest money deposit. How much, they call it a good faith deposit. And usually the good faith deposit's between 1 to 3% of the asking price. So in this case, a $400,000 home, 3% would be $12,000. So maybe they're asking people to put $12,000 down in an earnest money deposit. So in other words, when your offer is accepted, you are required to put that full $12,000 down as a sign of good faith. Basically, you're signaling to the seller, hey, I'm really interested in this property and I'm going to back it up with, the money right here that you're asking for. So, for example, I remember I had a client that was always wanting to bargain on that point of the earnest money deposit. So if they were asking for $5,000, he was always saying, well, let's see if they'll accept $3,000. And it never really went well, and I was always trying to encourage them to say, it's not going to look good if you do that. You're better off putting the full amount that they're asking for down. So that's just a general point, the next point to consider. Whatever amount the seller's asking for in the earnest money deposit, it's generally between 1 to 3% of the asking price. Put that full amount down and don't back away from that. So that's the second thing. And it shows them that you're serious about purchasing the home and you have the means to do it. So that's the second point, the earnest money deposit. And the next item, the main item to make your offer attractive, would come into what are the different contingencies. And the main contingencies that you have to do in order to purchase a home are the appraisal contingency and the inspection contingency. So what are they about? Well, the appraisal contingency means that if you're getting a loan for the amount that you're going to put down on the home, whatever that is, let's say let's go $400,000, and you're putting 10% down. So you'll be putting 40%. You'll be putting $40,000 down on the home. That means you're going to get a loan for $360,000. You're putting $40,000 down as a down payment. So you'll be getting a loan for $360,000. This is just hypothetical. Now let's say what happens then is the lender, when you have the offer accepted, they send an appraiser out to the property to say, well, how much is that property worth? The appraiser comes back and they say, well, the property is really, worth $350,000. Let's just say that in this example. So then the situation is the bank at that point is only going to lend you $350,000. So if you want to, and you've put down $40,000, so that means you would only be able to come up with $390,000. They're asking $400,000. So they call that an appraisal gap. And usually that means you either have to come up with the money on the appraisal gap. So they want $400,000. You're trying to get $360 from the bank and you're putting $40 down yourself, but now the bank's only willing to lend you $350. So there's a $10,000 difference. That's the appraisal gap. So some sellers, you can waive that contingency. You can say, if the appraiser comes in less, basically what you're saying is, we'll come up with a difference. So in that case, let's go back to this example I'm using. Let's say it appraises for $350. The bank's going to lend you $350. You've put down $40 already. You're going to have to come up with an additional $10. That's going to be $350 plus the $40 down payment plus $10 for the appraisal gap. Brings you to $400,000. So that's what an appraisal gap. That's what an appraisal contingency is all about. The other side of the appraisal contingency is, if you don't waive the appraisal contingency, what it means is, if the appraiser says this home is only worth $350, and so you're only getting $350,000, you have the right at that point to back out of the transaction, because the house is appraised for less than what the seller is asking for, or what you're able to put down, what you're able to come up with. So that's one contingency. So sometimes sellers, it's not really advised necessarily, but if you want to make your offer more attractive, that's one area that you can play around with, the appraisal contingency. And especially it means, you know, if you have a little money in reserve, if you really want the home and you really like it, maybe you have a little extra cash on hand, so if it does appraise for 5,000 or 10,000 less or something of that nature, or even just a couple of thousand, that you're going to be able to come up with that gap and still get the full purchase price that the seller is wanting. So that's one contingency, the appraisal contingency. But if you don't have the means to do that, then you can back out of the transaction at that point. And some loans, such as FHA loans and VA loans, require that appraisal, and they call it a mandatory clause that gives you the right to back out no matter what if the house isn't appraised for the amount that you're approved for. Okay, so that's appraisal contingencies. Let's do another one. Another major contingency that often happens is called the inspection contingency. So when you are buying a home, you have the right to inspect the home with a professional inspector. They're going to give you a report. And if you want to find out more about this, you can look at, I'm going to link right now to a video above that goes over the whole process. It's called Closing the Deal. If you want to know all the step-by-step process of what's involved in closing a deal, check that video out. We'll go into that in a little more detail. So with an inspection report, let's say you get an inspection and there's a number of issues. The one way you can go is that you put in what's called a formal request for repairs. So you're asking the seller, you know, there was a problem with an electrical item or the plumbing or the flooring somewhere, or might be a handrail or something of that nature, and we want you to fix it before, you know, we buy the property. And then that's a point of negotiation. The seller may come back and saying, we're not gonna repair anything, and if you don't like it, you have the right to back out of the transaction at that point. That's if you don't waive the inspection contingency. So that's what the inspection contingency is all about. If something comes up in the inspection report that you don't like, you have the right to back out of the transaction. Now, if you want to make your offer more attractive to the seller may even ask you to waive the inspection contingency. And they may do that in a counter offer. So they accept your offer, or you put an offer in and they come back with a counter offer and say, we like your offer, but we want you to waive the inspection contingency because, you know, we're not going to cover any repairs in the inspection report. And that happens. So what if that happens? Does it mean you can't have an inspection? No, you can still have an inspection, and then you can get an inspection report. It just means that the seller is not going to fix any items. They're saying to you, no matter what happens with the inspection, we're not going to fix any of those items. And this is, you know, this is a typical situation sometimes in, say, like a fixer-upper or a place that, you know, needs a little repairs. And in that case, you know, you might be fine with that. But anyway, that's another major point of negotiations. When you get an inspection done, are you going to, if you waive the inspection report, you're saying, hey, we're ready to buy this place, and we accept that, you know, there's some work that needs to be done on it. Or you may not want to go that route, but that's just another major point of negotiation. And that would be, in the beginning, I talked about final, and best terms, you know, highest and best terms. So for the seller, they may consider that, you know, a good term for them, that you're willing to buy the place without giving them a request for repairs. So that's another major point. Then beyond that, that kind of leads naturally into, sometimes the seller, they list it selling as is. The seller wants to sell you the property, they call it as is, meaning, you know, we know there's some problems, you know, in the property or not, you know, but whatever the case, we're not fixing anything. You know, if you have an inspection report, by all means you get an inspection, but we're not going to do any of the items in an inspection report. So you just have to buy it as it is and accept that. So that's not an uncommon situation either. So be prepared for that. That's another point, you know, in negotiation, and you may consider that or not in an offer. But if someone's listing their house as is, you should be prepared for that reality, that if you go in there ignoring their request to buy the property as is, and say, well, we want all these repairs anyway, they're probably just going to reject your offer. They're probably not going to accept your offer. They're going to back out of that transaction and probably accept that someone else who's willing to buy the house as is. And so that's another major point in negotiating and putting, you know, favorable terms in an offer. Of course, any most real estate agents are going to tell you, don't waive the inspection contingency and do not waive the appraisal contingencies. Keep them in there. You know, that's what I would advise anyone working with me. But, you know, some people don't want to do that, and that's okay too, but just be aware of what the consequences are if you waive the inspection contingency and you waive the appraisal contingency. If you waive the appraisal contingency, it means you might have to make up an appraisal gap. You might have to come up with an extra $10,000 or $5,000. If you waive the inspection contingency, it means if there are major repairs that are needed on the home, the seller is not going to fix them. Or doesn't need to fix them, or what it also means is you can't back out of the transaction. Like, oh, you mean there's a major sewer problem or there's something like that, you've waived the inspection contingency, you can't back out of the transaction if you waive the inspection contingency. Whereas if you keep it and you find a major problem, you have the right to say, we no longer want to buy this home, we're backing out of the deal. So that's kind of how all that works. And then there's another, some other favorable terms would be sometimes sellers want to rent back. So they want to actually stay in the home for, you know, maybe a short period of time. Maybe, you know, they're buying another property and they're waiting on that property to close, or maybe they're moving out of state and just need a little time to, you know, pack up and get ready, or, you know, there's a number of conditions. But sometimes a seller will be more favorable. I know recently there was an offer I made for a client on a home. It was owned by numerous siblings of the parents that had passed away, and one of the siblings was still living in the home and two others weren't. And, you know, the one sibling was saying, I really would love to have 30 days or more after the sale, you know, just to get my stuff all packed up. And so in that case, they wanted a rent back agreement, and it made the offer much more attractive than if we had not put they call it a lease back agreement. So after the sale, you as the buyer will not be moving in straight away. You'll be letting the seller stay there, and there's a number of options. You can let them stay there for free. That's the best option for the seller. Or the seller will pay, you know, whatever mortgage rate, you know, by determining, let's say they're staying there for a full 30 days. You know, they might say, well, we'll pay you the first 30 days, you know, of your mortgage, you know, basically the first monthly payment. Or you might come to an agreement of a set amount, you know, like a rental amount. You know, it might be, could be anything from 100 to 1,000 or whatever you agree to. So you can come to some terms, like the seller actually wants to stay there for 2 months. Sometimes even it might be 3 months. So, you know, these are different. And if it's an investment property, you know, they might even want to have a 6-month lease. So that's not all that common, but just be aware that that's another point of negotiation. To make your offer more attractive, you might offer the seller, you know, 1 free month of a rent back, lease back agreement if they wanted it. That would make your offer more attractive than an offer that didn't have that, for example. So another thing sellers might do is they might request, you know, a cross-reference with your lender. In other words, they want to use their lender just to double check on you that you're fully qualified and able to purchase the property. That's not that common, but that also sometimes happens. So, you know, that's another point, you know, of negotiation. But, you know, the main ones that we've covered, obviously there's the price, the fairest and best price, best terms. And those terms cover things that we've covered, like, you know, the appraisal. What happens if the house doesn't appraise for the full amount? Are you willing? Do you have money to come up with an appraisal gap or not? Are you going to back out of the transaction at that point? And what about the inspection? Are you willing to buy the house as is? What kind of repair requests are you going to make? Sometimes people are buying a place knowing that it needs a little attention as a fixer-upper. Maybe you're going to do some remodeling, so you're happy to waive the inspection request in that case because you're going to be doing repairs anyway. So that's another major point of negotiation. Then there's the idea of, you know, renting back for the seller. some kind of rent back agreement. And then another major point that's really important sometimes on the other side of the time factor is the contingencies. Is, you know, they call it, you know, X number of days to complete the contingency. So contingencies are things like, you know, getting your loan approved, the due diligence period for the home inspection, and the appraisal contingencies are the main ones, and you have so many days to complete those items. Now sometimes a seller may be in a hurry to complete the transaction because maybe they're moving and they need to, you know, to get the process moving along. There's a whole number of reasons. And also if you reduce the days of the contingency, so for example, let's say normally you have 10 days to carry out an inspection and do your due diligence and make a repair request. Let's say you reduce that to 7 days. And another one might be like the loan contingency. Normally, you know, it might be 30 days to get your loan approved. Well, maybe you already know ahead of time that you're going to get approved. So you reduce that contingency, say, to 21 days. So, you know, and the appraisal contingency likewise, you might reduce that from 21 days to 14 days or something like that. And what that does, it shortens up the transaction. So maybe you can close escrow instead of 30 days, maybe you can close in 21 days, for example. So in other words, you just get the whole process done more quickly. That can be a very attractive thing for many sellers. So that could be what you think of when you think of highest and best terms, highest price and best terms. Some sellers, if you shorten the contingency period, that could, for them, would be the best terms for them. They want to get the deal done quickly because they've got other things to do. So there's some points, you know, in general. We're talking very much in general terms about negotiating through an offer and, you know, what are the points of negotiation and how to make your offer attractive. So, you know, we could go into each and every one of those aspects more deeply, and they could have a video in and of themselves, but that's not what this video is for. This is just to give you a general idea of the process. But if you do have a question, please do leave me a comment, and I'll make a video on, you know, a question. If it's one part or the other, I'll be happy to answer you personally. And, you know, the other thing is look at the links below. I have links down below that go over different parts of the buying process, the closing process, so you might find some useful information in some of those other links to other videos. And the other thing is, if you found anything in this video to be helpful, hey, do me a favor, smash that like button, hit the subscribe button. You know, I'm not doing this to make any money. I'm doing this mostly for educational purposes, for you, a potential buyer. You know, so when you do that, you help, you know, more people out there hear the good message. So I'd appreciate that, and stay tuned for more videos, and I'll see you in the next video.